Okay, let's dive right into one of the most absolutely landmark disputes in WTO history. We're talking about the Korea beef case. If you're prepping for your international trade law exams, this is a massive one. We are going to break down exactly how a seemingly local battle over butcher shop shelves and domestic agricultural subsidies ended up completely redefining international trade law. We'll get into all the granular details you need for your exam, so grab your notes. So to make sure you have a rock-solid IRAC structure for your exam, we're splitting this explainer into three core legal silos. First, we've got procedural law, specifically the terms of reference. Second, we're getting into the weeds of the agreement on agriculture to calculate domestic support. And third, the really famous part, the dual retail system and substantive law under GATT Article 3.4. All right, Section 1, terms of reference, and how procedural jurisdiction actually works under the dispute settlement understanding. To set the stage here, Korea basically threw a procedural Hail Mary. They argued that the initial WTO panel ruled completely outside of its legal mandate. Why? Well, because the panel dug into Korea's Schedule LX and Annex 3 of the Agreement on Agriculture. But here's the catch, and it's a big one for DSU Article 6.2. Neither the United States nor Australia explicitly listed those specific texts when they first requested the panel. Korea was essentially saying, hey, you can't judge us on rules you didn't formally cite in your complaint. That prejudices our defense. It was a massive procedural gamble. But here's how the appellate body beautifully unraveled that argument, and it shows exactly how treaty texts interact. It's true. The US and Australia only explicitly claimed violations of Articles 3, 6, and 7 of the Agreement on Agriculture. However, if you actually read those specific articles, they directly refer to concepts like commitment levels and calculation methodologies. So the appellate body essentially said, look, Schedule X and Annex 3 are intrinsically linked to the explicitly claimed articles. You literally cannot calculate a violation of Article 6 without using the math found in Annex 3. Because of that direct textual linkage, the panel was perfectly within its rights to examine them. If you get a fact pattern on this in your exam, your absolute key takeaway is this. Direct textual linkage in the treaty language automatically grants the panel jurisdiction over those supplementary schedules and annexes. Even if a complaining party forgets to explicitly name a specific annex in their initial request, if the primary article they did cite relies on that annex to function, it's validly within the panel's terms of reference. Okay, moving on to Section 2. Let's look at how this procedural ruling set the stage for calculating domestic support under the Agreement on Agriculture. Now, this is where things get really interesting and, honestly, a bit messy. Korea's Schedule LX had a highly unusual formatting quirk that sparked a massive interpretive dispute. For the years 1997 and 1998, their schedule contained two totally different sets of commitment levels for domestic support, measured in billions of won. One set of figures was unbracketed, sitting right there in the open. But right next to it, there was another, much higher set of figures wrapped in parentheses or brackets. The multi-million-dollar legal question was, which of these sets represented Korea's actual, legally binding limit? So, initially, the panel looked at this and chose the lower, unbracketed figures. Their logic? Those numbers perfectly mathematically linked to Korea's base total aggregate measurement of support, or AMS. Makes sense, right? Well, the appellate body stepped in and completely reversed this, and they did it by strictly applying the customary rules of treaty interpretation from the Vienna Convention. Article 31, looking at the ordinary meaning in its context. It turns out the panel had totally ignored a tiny little asterisk, just a single footnote, Note 1, which directed readers to supporting Table 6. By looking at the entirety of the text, footnotes and all, the appellate body found that the bracketed figures were Korea's true commitment levels. They were higher because they accounted for a unique, renegotiated 1993 base year calculation specifically for rice. Now, you might be wondering, why are we agonizing over these exact billions of won? Well, it all boils down to the de minimis threshold. Under Article 6.4 of the Agreement on Agriculture, developing countries like Korea have a special buffer. If their product-specific domestic support stays under 10% of the total value of that product's production, it's essentially invisible. It doesn't count towards their total limit. 10% is the magic number. But if they cross that 10% line, every single one of that support gets dumped into their current total AMS. So the entire legal battle hinged on determining if Korea's beef subsidies had crept past that strict 10% threshold.
To figure out if they cross that line, we have to calculate the exact amount of support. And here's the twist. Korea hadn't actually subsidized beef during their original base period, so beef lacked constituent data in their base schedule. Because of this gap, the appellate body ruled that Korea couldn't just invent a new math formula. They had to strictly follow the mandatory steps explicitly defined in Annex 3. Step 1. Take a fixed external reference price from the strict base years of 1986 to 1988. Step 2. Find the gap between that fixed price and Korea's domestic administered price. Step 3. Multiply that gap by the total quantity of production that is quote-unquote eligible to receive the price. And this right here is where Korea made some absolutely fatal calculation errors. First, instead of using the mandatory 1986 to 1988 base years, Korea used 1989 to 1991. That's a direct violation of Annex 3. But the second mistake is the real exam tester. Korea calculated their final support number based on the amount of Hanwoo cattle the government actually ended up purchasing. But Annex 3 doesn't care about actual purchases. It explicitly requires you to use the quantity of production eligible to receive the price. Korea had previously announced to its farmers that 170,000 head of cattle were eligible for this price support. The fact that the government didn't actually end up buying all 170,000, completely irrelevant under WTO rules. So for your exams, here is the crucial distinction you need to memorize: the difference between actual purchases and eligible production. When a product isn't in a member's base schedule, Annex 3's strict calculation rules completely override whatever internal reality or methodology the member wants to use. Once a government formally declares a quantity eligible for support, that number is locked in for the subsidy calculation.
All right, let's transition to Section 3. This is, without a doubt, the most famous part of the case, Korea's dual metal system, and how it violently clashed with substantive law under GATT Article 3.4. The entire foundation of this section is the National Treatment Principle, specifically Article 3.4. It's a bedrock rule. Once imported goods clear customs and enter your domestic market, you must accord them treatment no less favorable than what you give to like domestic products. Now look at what Korea was doing with their management guideline for imported beef. They mandated that imported beef absolutely had to be sold in specialized separate stores. It was literally quarantined from domestic beef. You couldn't sell them in the same shop. Naturally, Australia and the US argued this completely obliterated national treatment. To resolve this, the appellate body laid down what is now a totally foundational quote in trade law. They stated that treatment no less favorable isn't just a matter of matching words on a page. It is entirely about preserving the effective equality of competitive conditions on the market. It's about making sure that an imported steak has the exact same commercial opportunity to be bought by a consumer as a domestic steak. This brings us to a brilliant illustration of de jure versus de facto discrimination. Korea's defense was basically, hey, this is perfect regulatory symmetry. They argued that because imported beef goes in imported stores and domestic beef goes in domestic stores, everyone is being treated equally under the law. It's formally neutral. But the appellate body completely rejected this de jure defense. They ruled that just because a law looks symmetrical on paper doesn't mean it's legal. You have to look at the de facto reality. Does the measure, in actual practice, worsen the conditions of competition for the imported good? And when you look at the actual braving market, the de facto discrimination was massive. Korea's dual system forced imported beef to basically build entirely new retail supply chains from scratch. It physically restricted imported beef from being sold in the vast majority of existing traditional butcher shops. But worst of all, it completely destroyed the consumer's ability to walk down a single aisle, compare the price and quality of Australian beef against Korean beef side by side, and just make a choice. It structurally handicapped the imported product. On top of all this, Korea also had a rule requiring mandatory signage. If you sold foreign meat, you had to display a big sign stating "Specialized Imported Beef Store." The appellate body didn't even really need to do a separate deep dive on this. They determined that the display sign was completely ancillary to the primary dual retail system. It was structurally inseparable. Because the physical segregation of the stores was a violation of Article 3.4, the sign requirement just collapsed right along with it. Now, Korea realized they were losing the Article 3.4 argument, so they pivoted to a classic defense, invoking the general exception under GATT Article XXD. They argued, okay, maybe we are restricting trade, but this segregation is absolutely necessary to secure compliance with our Domestic Unfair Competition Act.
Their argument was that without totally separate stores, local butchers would commit massive fraud. They'd take cheaper imported beef, slap a fake label on it, and pass it off to consumers as premium, super expensive domestic Hanwoo beef. This triggers the famous Article XXD necessity test, which you absolutely need to know step by step for your exam. Step 1, is the measure actually designed to secure compliance with a valid WTO-consistent law? The appellate body said yes. Stopping consumer fraud under the Unfair Competition Act is a perfectly legitimate goal. But step 2 is where it falls apart. Is this specific trade restrictive measure truly necessary to achieve that goal? This requires a weighing and balancing of factors. And here, the appellate body gave a resounding no. The reason Korea failed the necessity test is because of the concept of reasonably available alternatives. You don't need a sledgehammer to crack a nut, right? The WTO pointed out that if Korea wanted to stop butcher fraud, they could have used standard policing, strict inventory record keeping, surprise investigations, and heavy fines. In fact, Korea was already using those exact normal policing methods for other agricultural products. Completely segregating a national market and strangling foreign supply chains just to catch a few fraudulent butchers was drastically disproportionate. It wasn't necessary. So, pulling it all together for Article 3.4, your exam takeaway is this. Regulatory symmetry on paper is meaningless if it creates inequality in the real world. A formal difference in treatment is not an automatic violation, but if it de facto modifies the conditions of competition to the detriment of imported goods, it will fail national treatment. The WTO cares about the economic reality of market access. Let's wrap this explainer up with Section 4. We need to consolidate all this incredibly dense legal analysis and apply the Korea beef precedent to future disputes. Think about how the equality of competitive conditions test from this exact case would apply today. Imagine a country passes a totally facially neutral environmental law that in practice just happens to push all imported products to the dusty back shelves of the grocery store, away from the consumer's immediate view. Even if that law claims to treat everyone equally on paper, Korea beef teaches us that the practical reality is what matters. If you diminish the imported product's chance to compete directly on the shelf, it's a violation. It really forces us to ask, in today's complex regulatory environment, how many domestic laws are quietly acting as de facto protectionism? Well, now you have the legal framework to spot them. Keep studying hard and good luck on that exam.